In the United States, there's been a really pervasive claim lately especially in 2020 with everything that's been going on economically, stimulus, and different federal government programs, and whether or not they're going to be able to help out different states for whatever economic issues that they're facing. And we keep hearing, especially Trump and others though, but talk about mismanaged blue states. And blue, for anyone that's not familiar with the United States, that may be international watching, blue states generally is Democratic states, and red is Republican. So that's the terminology I'm going to be using for the rest of this video. So he's talking about mismanaged blue states and how they need to be bailed out, right? So it's basically what has caused this is you have Nancy Pelosi and other Nancy Pelosi, Cuomo, so California, New York, you have different blue states that are asking for more federal aid from the government, from the federal government, to help them deal with the coronavirus pandemic and with, what's been going on for the last several months. And to combat that, we keep hearing this tired line about how, blue states always spend their money and they're needing to be bailed out, and we shouldn't be bailing them out because they need to learn how to, spend their money wisely. What I want to do is let's look at the data. Let's see what, the reality is when we actually look at the analytics. So for perspective, and this is just for perspective on just COVID relief, right? The COVID relief that states got from the federal government, right? So New York, which is a blue state, received about $24,000 per positive COVID test, right? Seems like a pretty good amount, right? Probably like just the average person. Now, when we put this in perspective, Alaska, which is a pretty deep red state, received $3.3 million per positive case. Puts it in perspective. Now, we understand that these have very different population within each state. So, yeah, per capita, of course, it's going to be, roughly, it's going to be unequal if the numbers are anywhere close to the same. And that's why it's kind of important to understand what we're talking about when people are making a claim about a state needing to be, quote unquote, bailed out. When we're not comparing apples to apples, we're comparing Alaska's to New York's. So let's look at California, Texas, Florida, and some other red states. And let's just see, WalletHub did a really good job of putting together a list of red and blue states and how they rank in terms of federal dependency. So I want to look at that, and I'm going to be leaning on that for this video. So now that I'm sharing my screen with you, we can see over here we have the WalletHub study, and what they looked at is they're looking at what are the most federally dependent states. This is based on 2020 data, and we're looking at which states take in the most from the federal government compared to what they give to the federal government. So if you don't know, states take in taxes, they then pay taxes to the federal government, and then they get money back from the federal government when necessary. And that's the ebb and flow of how the federal and state governments work together in the United States to help out states when they need it, and to, have a state help out the other ones when they're in a better position. And that's generally how the system works. So let's look on here as an example. When we're looking, the most federally dependent state is New Mexico. And I have on the other side the electoral map from 2016, just showing, then this is actually on average from 2000 to 2016. So it'll depend on the specific election, but this is a good composite over the last 20 years to give you an idea. And what we're looking at is, okay, well, let's see, is there some type of a trend here, right? California, it's actually top 10 of least federally dependent. Texas, it's not quite that good, but it's like 15, right? 16, I believe, if I'm doing that math right in my head. New York, it's worse than Texas when it comes to federal dependency, at least this year, which makes sense. They got hit pretty hard, comparatively speaking. And then we look, though, we're looking at the most federally dependent. We're looking at states like Montana, Wyoming, New Mexico, Arizona, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Kentucky, West Virginia. You get the idea. Now, we also have states that are traditionally red that are not very federally dependent. As an example, Kansas, right? Utah, they aren't. Iowa, however, their economies are very different, and that's something that we're going to look at going forward. Let's look and then on top of that, let's look historically. Okay, well, what does this mean, right? Does this mean anything? And it does. Essentially, the issue you have is that, first of all, red states are on average more dependent on the federal government than blue states. Ironically, despite all the rhetoric that you hear, they are. They take in more money from the federal government than do blue states. Why? Which is the main question we really want to understand. And it's pretty obvious. The answer is that those states don't make as much money. On average, the people within them, the cost of living tends to be lower in red states. So you end up being able to stretch your dollar further within red states, and people make less money. If people make less money, and on top of that, in red states, you tend to have lower taxes, meaning lower percentage taxes, so lower tax rates. If you're taxing less on lower income, you have less revenue. If you have less tax revenue, you will need more money from somewhere else to cover the expenses that are necessary in that state. It's not complicated. And it's not controversial. It shouldn't be. It's not a competition between red or blue states. The point is, why? What is happening? And just looking at these type of claims and calling them for what they are, right? It's not complicated. Now, this is a really cool study from Georgetown that I wanted to show, and it's talking about the growing, and all of this stuff is linked below. It's talking about the growing divide between red and blue states. And it's pretty alarming and something that we want to keep in mind when we're looking at, okay, well, why would someone live in a state that's higher taxes, like, California? Why would someone choose that? What's the reason? Why would I choose that over a state where I could pay less in taxes? It should be a no-brainer that I want to pay less in taxes, right? The problem when you look at is that in these states, we can see over time since, 2000, which is how far back this graph goes, since the recession, basically, we've seen that Democratic-led states tend to have higher median household incomes. And not only that, it's growing further and further apart over time, which is only going to further exacerbate this problem of lack of federal funding in those states, because the higher people make in a higher tax state, the more tax revenue that state is going to have. When we're looking at then poverty rates, we can see poverty rates are lower in blue states. Why do we think that might be? Well, if we have higher taxes and we're able to fund better social programs, better education, then we're going to have less, and also higher minimum wages. That's important because this is comparing to the federal poverty line. That's a pretty big deal, right? If you're looking at, so what it comes down to is, what outcomes do you want? When you're paying taxes in a state, you're essentially paying for how the government, or at least how able the government is to spend money on necessary, what they deem necessary programs. And those programs, if they are effective, should help the average person's outcome, which, as we can see, again, uninsured rate, which that depends on, your perspective on that. But then when we're looking at, high school diplomas, it's roughly about the same. Generally speaking, the United States has done a pretty good job when it comes to that. Overall, bachelor's degrees, this shouldn't really be too complicated. I mean, when you're looking at it as an example, the bluest states, you're talking about California and New York, and both of those, you have a lot of high-paying college required jobs, so they're going to have higher rates of people with bachelor's degrees. It's not really a complicated thing to understand. And then we're even looking at like employment rate. It's about the same. Employment rate is not, which actually helps with the whole combating the whole argument about raising the minimum wage or raising or lowering taxes across state lines changes or affects unemployment rate a lot. It doesn't. I did a video on that as well earlier. I'm talking about minimum wage myths, so definitely check that out if you're interested. But as we can see, and then GDP per capita, it's going to be pretty high just because of the higher wage jobs that you have in Democratic-led states. And then this is just a composite breakdown of that. But the point is that this bickering that is what inevitably comes from the rhetoric that is being used about mismanaged blue states or mismanaged red states, it's stupid, right? The problem you have is that if we aren't putting enough money back into the public sector in order to make things better, then we have less public investment in those areas, which makes those areas fall behind, which is what you're seeing with red states over the last 20 years, specifically, according to this study. It's been going on longer than that, but at minimum the last 20 years. Then comes, okay, well, if someone really wants the answer is, are states mooching? No, that is stupid. Nobody, like, there is no such thing as a welfare state. And I know people that, may be listening that were happy. We're like, oh yeah, he's putting it to the red one. No, there's no such thing as a welfare state. There's no such thing as a mooching state. Okay. A welfare state or a mooching state is one that is just not doing a good job of supporting their citizens effectively, right? Our system in the United States is set up so that the federal government can reallocate funds to areas that need help. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Just like there's nothing wrong with helping people that are in more, individual people that are in more need within a society, because it helps the society as a whole grow and become better and have better outcomes overall. We need to do the same thing, and we need to make sure that our government is making our lives better so that we can have those outcomes. And if they aren't, then we need to do something about that, right? And we need to have some sort of a referendum, whether that's voting or picketing or what we need to do in order to fix that problem. Overall, the takeaway is that this is just a dumb talking point, and all it really serves to do is divide working class people. We shouldn't be arguing over whether or not, red states or blue states are better, because that isn't the reason you choose to live a place. Most people choose based on either their economic means to be able to move or their economic incentive to move, i.e., how much money they're able to make in a job because there's a job that they want to work in another state versus where they're at. Red and blue doesn't really decide where people live. Most of us tend to live in the same state we were born in our entire lives, which is another thing entirely. But what really matters is that we need to push for our local and state governments to invest in our community so that we get more from our taxes. And we need to remember that this is always a give and take, right? If we produce less tax revenue in a state, then we will have less public funds, right? And demonizing states based on a political leaning without trying to solve the issue is just counterproductive and only serves to hurt the average working class person. If you enjoyed this clip, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out the full live version of the Wealth for 99 podcast, where we talk finance, economics, and public policy from a working class perspective. We'll see you there.